Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jill Brown, Director of Public Programs at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us for our program today, Rescue and Resistance, Female Fighters of the Holocaust, presented by the museum's Vice President of Education and Exhibits, Jordanna Gessler. Jordanna will be happy to answer your questions, so if you have a question, please click on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your question there. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jordanna Gessler.
Thanks so much, Jill. Welcome everyone. One moment while I just share my screen so I can take you on a virtual tour of the museum. Thank you so much for joining me today as we talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is female fighters, different heroines who were part of the rescue and resistance during the Holocaust. And we're now looking at the museum here, nestled in Pan Pacific Park. And we're going to go walk in. And so, so now we're descending into the museum space. And the museum was actually originally designed with the intention of creating a different area and a juxtaposition between a beautiful park that's open and has clean air and is just filled with chirping birds and running children and barking dogs, to really understanding the complexities and the difficult history that was the Holocaust. And with that understanding that when you're standing inside the museum, which is subterranean, you are part of a different world. And that's oftentimes what many people experiencing the Holocaust firsthand felt. So here we're going to descend this ramp into the front doors of the museum, and we're going to head down to our sixth gallery. So we're walking through the museum gallery space because our sixth gallery is the gallery that deals with rescue and resistance. And before we kind of look around the gallery and explore the different figures we're going to talk about today, I wanted to talk about the definition of resistance. The definition of resistance with regard to Holocaust history has evolved over the decades. Some historians believed in taking a very narrow understanding of the term. For example, Raoul Hilberg, who's notably one of the first Holocaust historians and was a professor at the University of Vermont, where I went for my undergrad. He wrote in his groundbreaking work, Destruction of the European Jews, that resistance could only be understood as a preventative attack, armed and with revenge. He identified only acts of armed opposition as resistance. And really since then, this is when he was writing in the 70s, it was a very narrow look at this term, but since then, it's expanded over time in our understanding. And for example, in her work Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, historian Marianne Kaplan expanded this definition of resistance to include using false documents, spreading information amongst the Jewish grapevine, going underground, attempting to save Jewish lives. Resistance included taking a risk while indirectly or directly combating the Nazis in ways that were not restricted to armed conflict. So we really now understand that resistance took several different forms, including spiritual resistance, so just the ability to maintain a Jewish holiday while amongst a ghetto or a camp, to celebrate Shabbat, to celebrate even a wedding, despite the abhorrent world and murderous and violent world around Jewish people, intellectual resistance, which we'll explore a little bit when we talk about Anne Frank's diary, but also a very well-known archives that were created in the ghetto. So ghetto archives, just documenting experiences, cultural and physical resistance. This all very much counts as resistance. In German-occupied Europe, Jews carried out acts of armed resistance in ghettos, in forests, in the death camps, acting in groups alone, but more importantly, the will to survive and the will to defy the Nazis and maintain human dignity, really today we consider an act of resistance. So if we turn just to the right, we can see here's Anne Frank, a very well-known young woman who kept a diary in hiding in the Netherlands. I won't go too much into her story because it's one of the most well-known stories when it comes to Holocaust history, but Anne Frank in a diary, in an attic, kept this diary where she detailed everything that was going on around her, whether it was her hopes for a better world, her fears that they would be found, and created a best friend in her diary. She even called her diary Kitty. And just her ability to create a confidant, a space where she could speak her mind and be her true self, that's spiritual resistance. When we look at the Holocaust, we're really looking at a sequence of dehumanization. Starting in 1933, the Nazis and their collaborators worked to dehumanize groups of people, primarily Jews, and any act in which a person maintained their human dignity despite what was going on around them is really an act of resistance. So I think it's so important for us to begin this gallery talking about Anne Frank and seeing that even though she did not survive the Holocaust, her mark is really one of resistance. And you can see the picture next to her is an image of the building in the Netherlands, which is where they were in hiding before they were denounced and found and sent to concentration camps. And actually, next to that is one of our female fighters, and that's Meep. And Meep was one of the people who tried to hide the Frank family. And even after they were denounced, she's the one who collected Anne Frank's diary. So even though at some point she was no longer able to save Anne Frank as a person, she was able to save Anne Frank as a spirit and save her intellectual property. And actually, it's interesting because Meep once said, in reflecting after the Holocaust, that people should never think that you have to be a very special person to help those who need you. And as we're talking today about different figures, we will see that all of these women had enormous capacity to do the right thing in the face of the violent and horrific things that were happening around them, but they were just everyday, average people. Of course, there are very famous rescuers during the Holocaust who had means and connections to save Jews, and they are equally as important. But at the end of the day, all of these women had spirit, they had hope, they had compassion, and they had human dignity. And I think that's a really important part of this. And following the Holocaust, Meep was awarded Righteous Among the Nations, and we'll just identify that term here. So Righteous Among the Nations is an official title that's given to non-Jews, sometimes known as righteous Gentiles. So Gentiles it means non-Jewish, who risked their lives in order to rescue Jews during the Holocaust at no benefit to themselves. So they didn't benefit economically or in any other way. This is at a time when Nazi-sponsored persecution and mass murder really was throughout Europe. And so these small but impactful group of people are important to notice and to note because they are truly righteous. And when somebody is nominated for a Righteous Among the Nations and are awarded such by Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem and Israel, they receive a medal. Here you can see it as an example of the medal, and their name is inscribed in this beautiful garden of the righteous for everybody to learn about. And I included here a photograph. The black and white photograph is the woman who helped save my grandfather. And the lower photo is my grandfather's siblings lighting the eternal flame in her honor when she was awarded Righteous Among the Nations. And just thinking, it takes one person to have such a ripple effect and an impact. And if it wasn't for this woman here, her name was Elizabeth, I probably would not be here today because my own grandfather would most likely have not survived the Holocaust. And so these people really, it's such an incredible, courageous thing. And for people to do the right thing, it truly is something that inspires us all to perhaps be a little bit better, to be a better person. And so as we walk through the gallery space, here, this is a beautiful shot of inside our gallery, and you can see 3 women whom I'm going to be talking about today. So all the way on your right-hand side, you see Irena Sendler. In the middle, you kind of see, there's a weird glare, that's Hannah Senis, and then you see Sophie Scholl. So we'll be talking about these 3 extraordinary women who were able to stand up in the face of something so horrific. So let's begin with Irena Sendler. She was Polish. She was a social worker, a nurse, and she was part of the Polish underground under Nazi occupation in Poland. And she was specifically head of the children's section. And she would organize and smuggle Jewish children out of the Warsaw ghetto. And so the Warsaw ghetto was actually the largest of all of the ghettos in Europe. Nearly 500,000 Jews were forced to live in a very confined space. Living conditions were horrific. there were deportations, people were being murdered, and Irina would smuggle herself into the ghetto, and she would smuggle children, young children, mostly babies. And of course we think, you know, why would she smuggle young children or babies instead of older children? And really you have to remember that once they were out of the ghetto, they still needed to survive every single day, hopefully with false identity. And older children might have more trouble remembering their new names and the fact that they weren't supposed to remember their parents. And so it also meant that people had to, thinking about the parents in the ghetto who wanted to give up their children and hope that their children would survive. And that was a very difficult decision for many people. But so Irina would then identify children to smuggle out of the ghetto. She would take them out in bags and sacks. Sometimes they were loaded in goods, in toolboxes. Some were placed in coffins and taken out of the ghetto. So many different ways to smuggle the children out. And then once she smuggled them out and saved their lives, she then had to organize new identities for the children and found them safe places to hide, whether it was in an orphanage or a convent or a school or a hospital or with families. And another thing that I think is so extraordinary about this woman is that she rescued all of these children, and they all had to have new names and new identities, but she documented their original names and their birth names and who they were. And she wrote it down and buried these names in her backyard. And so she wasn't just saving their lives, but she was saving their identity so that after the war, they would know that they had actually been Jewish. She was able to save over 2,500 children in this way, which is incredible. She was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. She was tortured brutally. She would not give up any of the information, even under torture. She was then sentenced to be killed, but other members of the underground actually rescued her. So she never revealed any of the children or any of their locations, and she narrowly escaped death. She survived the Holocaust and actually passed away when she was well into her 90s. And she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize many years ago. So her work is well known, and it's just such a remarkable story. And here we can also, this is Hannah Senis, so that photo that was cut out before. And so Hannah Senis was initially born in Budapest in the 1920s. However, in 1939, she decided to go study this is agriculture. It's always a word that I have trouble with, in the British Mandate of Palestine, and basically got stuck there during World War II after the outbreak of war. And in 1943, due in fact because of her language of speaking Hungarian, because she was Hungarian, she volunteered to join the Palmach, to join the army. And she first studied to be a wireless operator and then studied to be a paratrooper. And in 1944, she and several other Jews from the Mandate were dropped into Yugoslavia as paratroopers. And I think it was about 30. She was about one of 30 Jews. And they were part of the British Army. And their intention was to help organize resistance against the Nazis and their collaborators and try to help rescue Jews. So she then, a few days later, they entered into Hungary, and unfortunately she was and several others were arrested. I think they believe that only one of these paratroopers survived the Holocaust. She was tortured, and she was brutally tortured to try to get her to give up on the wireless codes that she knew in different locations from the British Army. And she did not give up any of this information. And in 1944, she was tried for treason and sentenced to death. She was 23 years old at this time. Her mother actually did survive the Holocaust, and it's through her mother that we were able to get her diaries and her writing. In 1950, her remains were transferred to Israel to be buried. And I think it's also important to understand that rescue and resistance, people were Jewish, they were non-Jewish. It really, the different opportunities for people to rescue and resist. If somebody was Jewish, it was a little bit harder, but because she was able to join the British Army and paratroop in as a part of an army. It's pretty incredible at her age and during that time. And she is a very well-known poet now, that we have her writings. And there's a very famous song called Eli Eli, which is based on a poem. And here's the writing in Hebrew and in English. And actually it's a song as well that I'm not going to sing, but her writing was so beautiful and just such a remarkable young woman. And then I'm going to also jump in to talk about Sophie Scholl. And so Sophie Scholl was actually German. She was living in Munich, and she and her brother and a few other students at the university in Munich decided to form an organization called the White Rose. And you have to remember, at this time, the Nazi government was very much in control of propaganda and media and news. It was even, people would be arrested and tortured even if they were suspected for listening to BBC. The Nazis wanted to ensure that people were only listening to whatever Nazi information was being propagated, because oftentimes the Nazis were lying about what was happening. Of course, we can imagine that. And by 1942, 1943, the turn of the war was changing. The tide of the war was changing. The Nazis were actually losing many battles. However, this is not what they were reporting to the citizens of Germany. They were oftentimes saying, no, of course, Germany is winning and the Allied armies are losing, etc. So what Sophie and the other members of the White Rose did is they clandestinely listened to BBC News and listened to other news outlets that were completely illegal for somebody in Germany at that time to be listening to. They took significant risk in doing this, and then they produced leaflets with all of the correct information. So with the accurate information that perhaps they were writing about what was happening to German Jews or what was happening during the war with the military, and they were denouncing the regime and sharing the truth of what was happening throughout Europe. And they would go at night and spread these leaflets everywhere. So the next morning when people woke up, they would walk out onto the street and pick up leaflets and actually read the truth. So this is, I mean, really the fact that they were just fighting for freedom of knowledge and freedom of speech and freedom of the press even. So the White Rose members would spread these leaflets all over Munich, send them to students in other major cities, including Vienna and Berlin. They wrote, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will never leave you in peace." Unfortunately, one evening at the university, a janitor saw them and denounced them to the Gestapo. Sophie and her brother Hans and another member, Christopher, were arrested. They were tortured and they were executed on February 22nd, 1943. So this is somebody who fought for people to know the truth of what was happening, despite such a terrible, or despite the lies that were being fed to them, and they were and she was executed for this. And then another, oh, here's a picture of the memorial. Now, if you go to Munich, you can see this really incredible memorial where there are fake leaflets, but they're actually the real leaflet text, but not real paper. And it's just very subtly laid out on the ground. And so you can walk around and be reminded of the way in which Sophie and the other members of the White Rose fought for people to have freedom of information and to know the truth of what was happening in the world. This other moment I want to talk about was a public protest in Nazi Germany. And I know that when we think of Nazi Germany, we don't always consider protesting to be a part of that history, because there were not very many public protests in Nazi Germany. And this is the Rosenstrassa Protest. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the history behind the protest, or behind the events that led to the protest, I should say. So in Germany in 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were enacted, they made it illegal for German Jews and German non-Jews to be married. However, there of course had been many marriages between Jews and non-Jews in Germany before that, and the law did not force divorces. Instead, the Nazi government used incredible social pressure and economic pressure to try to get the non-Jewish spouse to divorce the Jewish spouse. However, many couples remained together despite this, out of love, out of obligation, out of family. I'm going to just assume that it was always out of love, though. And, you know, they underwent a lot of intense pressure in Germany. And the Nazi government very much wanted to say that Germany was free of Jews, that they had deported all of the Jews of Germany out mostly to Eastern Europe to be killed. And so it was a very complicated situation for the German government. And the increased persecution of those in mixed marriages, especially after the final deportations of the Jews who were not married or did not have parents who were not Jewish, to the east, demonstrated the regime's angst in finding a solution to rid Germany of all the Jews who lived there. So there were sporadic deportations of Jews and mixed marriages, beginning as early as 1942, when in Frankfurt, Germany, some of them were sent to concentration camps in Theresienstadt, but these were very sporadic, and it wasn't sort of a decision that the government was taking. Historian Wolf Gruner, who's a historian at USC, he estimates that at the beginning of 1943, a total of 16,760 people lived in mixed marriages in Germany proper. So that's a significant amount of Jews who are living in Germany and who are protected because of their marriages. In February of 1943, during a nationwide action, which was a moment where the German government would go and arrest large groups of Jewish people, thousands of Jews were seized by the Gestapo and the SS from their forced labor sites, because many of these Jews were in forced labor and had to live in specific areas of the city. So they were seized from their forced labor sites and the streets, even their homes. And this was a roundup, and it included Jewish men in mixed marriages. So then this sparked in Berlin the only demonstration to save Jews from deportation that took place during the Holocaust. The wives of the arrested men knew that oftentimes at this point in Germany, if a Jewish person was arrested and deported, they were oftentimes not heard from again, which didn't leave people believing that the best things were happening to them, to put it lightly. So most of the wives assumed that if their husbands had been arrested, that they would eventually probably be murdered, or at least tortured and imprisoned. So hundreds of wives and other family members took to the street in open protest on Rosenstrassa, that's the name of the street, for the release of their Jewish family members who they said were supposed to be protected by mixed marriages. So the Rosenstrassa Protest exemplified the great extent that non-Jewish spouses and family members would go in order to protect their loved ones from deportation, which ultimately implied death of some sort. The actions taken by the regime compelled these women to become politically active and cause social disobedience, which frustrated the brutal dictatorship that was very much obsessed with public opinion. And ultimately, this protest went on for several days, and the majority of the men were released by the Nazi government and survived the Holocaust. So the women on the Rosenstrasse protest openly defied their government, and it was a successful protest because the men were released. And there's a lot of interesting historical commentary on this and the political aspect of it. But I think at the end of the day, what's important to remember is that these women understood what they wanted and were willing to face perhaps even death in order to publicly protest and say that they wanted their loved ones released. And it ultimately resulted in a success, which is a really just incredible story. And so here is a street sign. You can see where it says Rosenstrasse, which is where the protest took place. And here's a memorial that is currently in Berlin that you, once the pandemic is over, you can go and visit and learn more about this incredible feat. So we're going to turn to the other side of the gallery, and here we see a lot of images. There's so much in this gallery that I wish we had time to talk about, but the Holocaust history is very large and it's very complex. And so I think it's important to take chapters of it and build on a foundation of knowledge. And I do want to give time for questions to hear from the audience as well. So if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A chat. And even though when we look at the Holocaust, we see the capacity of people to do the most horrific things to one another, we also see the capacity of people to do the most incredible things to save one another. And even though that second number is much smaller, I think the impact is great. As I said earlier, perhaps I would not be here if not for the heroic bravery of one woman to save my grandfather's life. And it's important to study those people, even if it's a much lower number in comparison to the people who did terrible things. I think that this teaches us that we all have the capacity to be an upstander. We all have the capacity to speak up. And whether it's openly protesting like the Rosenstrassa protest, whether it's sharing information like the White Rose, whether it's actively trying to organize resistance like Senis, or rescuing children like Irena Sendler, I think that there's something that everybody can do in times of trouble to even just reach out and support another human being. And so now we're actually going to be looking at something that took place in the concentration camps themselves. And here's Rosa Rabata, closer there. So you can see she's up on our panel under Sonderkommando because she was part of the Sonderkommando uprising. But here is the close-up photograph of her. We're going to talk a little bit about her and what took place in the Sonderkommando uprising. So she was actually born in Poland. She had a brother and a sister. She was very involved in her local Jewish life, a middle-class family. She was part of Zionist youth organizations and also writing and theater groups. After the invasion of Poland and during the Holocaust, she and her family were taken to a ghetto. And then during the liquidation of that ghetto, she was sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. She was selected to be sent to Birkenau, which was Auschwitz II, which had forced labor for women. And there she became involved in the underground of Auschwitz. And she would disseminate news amongst the prisoners. So even within Auschwitz concentration camp, which arguably is the symbol of destruction during the Holocaust, you can see people's commitment to maintaining human dignity, their commitment to not give up, to share news, to organize an underground, to maintain hope amongst people, it's so unbelievable to think about. And so she joins the underground, and there was a group that was also part of the underground called the Sonderkommando, and they had a very terrible job in the camps. They were responsible for moving the bodies from the gas chambers to the crematoria and really firsthand witnessing the mass murder that the Nazis were doing. And they decided that they were going to act, and they were going to try to blow up one of the gas chambers. So for many months, Jewish young women, including Rosa, smuggled small amounts of gunpowder from a factory within the camp complex. It was a very large complex. They smuggled it in the hems of their dresses, underneath their fingernails, however they could, tiny, tiny, tiny amounts over time. And they smuggled it to the Sonderkommando. They were under constant guard, so it was small amounts each moment. They would wrap it in bits of cloth, hide it on their bodies, like I said, in their fingernails, and they would smuggle it along a chain. So it eventually got to the Sonderkommando. And on October 7th, 1944, the Sonderkommando prisoners revolted. They blew up one of the gas chambers and crematoria, which was part of the same building. They killed several SS guards. The revolt was quickly suppressed by the camp guards, and the members of the Sonderkommando were killed. And it's actually interesting because they most likely knew they were not going to survive this revolt. They also most likely knew they were unable to blow up all of the gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau because there were several of them, but they blew up one anyway. And it really makes us think about why do people revolt? Why do people act out? Why do people fight? And even if it means not creating an end to the Holocaust, why did they do this? And I've heard many survivors who speak at our museum constantly, or speak at our museum frequently, that they constantly will talk about their experiences in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and that they remember this revolt. They remember when the gas chamber was blown up, and just thinking about how that could have inspired them filled them with hope, or thinking that people were fighting. It's incredible to even think what the ripple effect was within the prisoner complex of Birkenau. And of course, that information spread throughout the camp, and I think it gave many prisoners their hope. The Germans really the Nazis wanted to investigate what had happened, how the Sonderkommando had even got in the gunpowder to begin with. And so they brought in an undercover agent and to investigate, and they discovered the names of women prisoners who had taken part in the smuggling. They eventually arrested 3 female prisoners alongside Rosa, and she and the other prisoners were tortured. Many other people in the underground in the camp were still alive because they had not been found, and they were afraid that their names would be given up under torture, which they were not. These women did not give up their names, did not share the information, and on January 6, 1945, 2 weeks before Auschwitz, maybe 3 weeks before Auschwitz is liberated by the Soviet army, Rosa and the other women were hanged in the presence of other prisoners. And there are no known survivors from Rosa's family. And so just acknowledging the heroic actions that this woman took, I think is really important to remembering her. I had mentioned before that there are many survivors who speak at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, and I want to share sort of the personal narratives of one of them in our community. I think it's so important for students and visitors who come to the museum, who participate in our virtual programs like you're doing today, to learn about the local survivors who might be, they're not famous, there aren't books written about them necessarily, or movies, or they're not appearing on the news, but their stories of resistance and survival are just as incredible, and I think very important to share, and it's part of the mission of the museum to commemorate, educate, and inspire, and to use these survivor stories to inspire. So this is the last story I will share with you. So if we pretend walk to the other side of the gallery, there is a vitrine here filled with artifacts. Here it is. And so these artifacts are part of the personal collection from a survivor in our community named Idel. She sadly passed a few years ago, but she would oftentimes speak at the museum. She loved speaking to young kids, and she and her family loaned us these artifacts. And so I'm going to share a little bit about her experience during the Holocaust, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. So Idel was initially born in Berlin, Germany. Her parents had been Polish Jews who came to Germany before the war, or before the rise of the Nazis. And her mother died in childbirth. It's a very long story, but ultimately the Nazis, after the Nazis came to power, they moved to deport any non-German Jewish citizens, including Idel's father. Idel remained in Germany, having been born there. She ended up in a Jewish orphanage that was destroyed during Kristallnacht, and then she ends up on a Kindertransport, which was this movement to at least get Jewish children out of Germany and German areas to safety. Most of what we know about the Kindertransport is related to the United Kingdom, where about 10,000 Jewish children were taken in, but there were Kindertransports that went to Switzerland. Dr. Ruth, a very well-known woman, she was on a Kindertransport to Switzerland. There were Kindertransports to Sweden, and then also to France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, which is where Idel was sent. And she arrived in Brussels, and a mother-daughter duo, Germaine and Marie, they decided to take her in. So this is just, a family, a woman with her daughter. And on January 5th, 1939, they decided to take Idel in. They understood that she was Jewish. They, of course, were not Jewish. And they understood that there was danger and violence happening in Nazi Germany. Belgium is not under Nazi occupation at this time, and so they just at first offer her a safe place to live. They had a children's clothing company in a building. They lived in a 3-floor building, and the first building was the store, and then they lived above the store. I think very traditional at that time. Then, of course, in June of 1940, the Nazis invade France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and now Marie and her mother are actually their lives are in danger for harboring a Jewish person. Idel called the 2 women her aunts, and she learned how to speak Flemish and French because she'd been born in Germany, and they enrolled her in a Catholic school. They got her fake papers, and here we can actually see some of the artifacts. So if we're looking at the case in the forward part of the gallery space, there are some images which we can't zoom into right now, but those are just images of Idel living with the 2 women. They treated her like family. You can see in the back right corner, that's actually a class photo from Idel's school classroom. And they were so worried that if this photograph got out, that somebody might recognize her as Jewish, that they told her when the camera shutter clicked to shake her head very vigorously. And so it blurred her face. And so she would be unrecognizable. And you can also see the medal, which we'll talk about, this award, which I mentioned earlier, which is given to righteous among the nations, the righteous Gentiles, the non-Jews who risked their lives for no benefit to themselves except for the goodness of their hearts to save a person. And here's the award that was given to them following the end of the war. And actually, here's a picture of Adele with the two women. They got her a false identification card. They changed her name. Of course, this is all illegal, right? They're getting her a false identity that says that she's not Jewish. So through the years, they rescued her throughout the entire Holocaust. And following the Holocaust, they were liberated by the British Army. And Adele always referred to them as her aunts, and really understood that they had risked their lives to save her. And here we can take maybe a close-up. Here's this, this is a fake ID card. It has her wrong birth year, her wrong nationality, her wrong name. Here you can see the picture of her with the two courageous women and the award that was given to them by Yad Vashem. In 1993, Adele traveled to Yad Vashem and unveiled plaques at Yad Vashem and got these women recognized for their courage. And here, the last image, we can see a picture of Adele at the museum in the gallery we're standing in, or virtually standing in today, with her two daughters. And thinking that if it wasn't for the courage of these quote unquote ordinary women who did something extraordinary, who knows what would have happened. And I think that's such an important part, is really understanding that every good deed during the Holocaust had this ripple effect and had such a great impact on creating a better world and a kinder world where we can care for one another. So I'm gonna end my screen share, and that way we can have a little conversation and see if there are any questions from the audience or if there are any thoughts about what we discussed. I also wanted to share that I know we talked a little bit about the risks that people took to rescue. And as we saw, as I mentioned, not every one of the women I talked about today survived the Holocaust. Some of them were killed by the Nazis, or in Irena Sendler's case, faced execution but was rescued. And just thinking about the way in which people decided to do the right thing. And remembering what Meep said was that people didn't need to be a special person to do the right thing, that it's always inside of each of us. And I think that's a very important thing to consider. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Jordanna. Thank you for that. I always enjoy learning from you about Holocaust history. And for those of us who miss being in the museum, it was really nice to virtually visit Gallery 6, which I know is a favorite of many of our docents who are participating today, because it focuses on these brave rescuers. So we do have some questions from the audience. Let's start with, so Irina Sendler, you mentioned she was captured and tortured and that other members of the resistance managed to rescue her. How did they manage to do that?
Well, I mean, she was part of one of the largest underground networks in Poland at that time, which was mostly Polish Catholic people for the most part. There were some Polish Jews who were able to be part of the underground, but of course it's a little bit more complicated. And they had far reach and connections within the ministries. And so they were able to organize this really heroic rescue of her. And I think when we think about the underground, we might think about it being 15, 20 people, but it was actually an immense network that spanned across the different ministries throughout Poland and throughout most of Europe. So there were people with connections, and it was just a matter of using those connections to rescue someone who was so significant.
Thank you. Someone else is asking, how are we able to gather information about people who were killed? And I had the same question about Rosa Robota. You mentioned she was hanged, and I think you said that no members of her family survived. So what is the source of our knowledge about these people, and particularly the Sonderkommando revolt?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, there will never be a time, I think, where we can collect every single name of every single person who was murdered in the Holocaust, because of course, entire villages, families, towns were killed. There were, I mean, generally, there were birth records and marital records, which help us in our archives collect the names of people who perished. But so something with the Sonderkommando uprising is actually the Sonderkommando themselves wrote about their uprising and wrote about their daily life, and they wrote it and buried it underground, and it was found afterwards. And so we know a lot about the Sonderkommando and what went on by the gas chambers and the crematoria in Birkenau because they documented it. We know about their life, and so we also know about this underground. And as I said earlier, there were other members of the underground within the camp who had been afraid of being caught, and Rosa and the other women did not give up those names. So those people could have also survived and then also had that information. And there are very many people in the camp who actually witnessed the hanging. So it's really through spoken word of mouth and oral testimony.
Right, okay. A question about Meep Geese and Anne Frank. So obviously they were renounced and Anne Frank and her family were deported. Did the Nazis do anything to punish Meep Geese and the people who were hiding in France?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a very complicated thing because it's based on country, what the consequences were for people hiding Jews. And, you know, in Eastern Europe, the Nazis had a racial hierarchy, and they placed people in Eastern Europe lower on their hierarchy and people in Western Europe as higher. So their treatment of people in Eastern Europe was vicious. If a family was caught, if a family was caught in Eastern Europe hiding Jews or helping Jews, the entire family would be murdered on the spot. Whereas in Western Europe, the Nazis were a little bit more cautious about public opinion. And so they were more likely to be arrested and deported, but not everybody was. And actually, Anne Frank was denounced very late in the war. And so there wasn't really any severe or significant punishment for the rescuers of the Frank family.
Thank you. So back to the Rosenstrassa Protest. Did I get that name right?
Rosenstrassa Protest, yeah.
Rosenstrassa. Question about what happened after that protest. Were the Jewish husbands and the wives who were not Jewish able to live together in Germany during the remainder of the war?
Yeah, they were. So couples in mixed marriages in Nazi Germany, as I said earlier, the Jewish men were oftentimes forced to be slave laborers in labor camps. They were all forced to live in something called Jewish houses, which is similar-ish to ghettos, but not actually. So basically, the couples and their families were removed from their homes and forced to live with many other couples in kind of confined spaces. They weren't allowed to go to the grocery store at certain times or ride the public transportation. And basically all of the laws that were against Jews in Nazi Germany then also pertained to the non-Jewish spouse. So they had to experience that as well. But they lived. So after that protest, there was never another roundup significantly like that of the Jewish spouses and the Jewish family members within a mixed family. And so, yeah, they were able to survive and live. I mean, it was difficult, but they lived together until the end of the war.
Were any of the organizers of that protest punished in any way?
No. They were out there, and it wasn't so much like an organized protest in the way that we see it today. It was more just, the women showing up and refusing to leave until their husbands and their family members were released. And there were threats. The Gestapo threatened them. The protest went on for several days, and then the men were released. And it's interesting because we oftentimes, the Nazi government was a brutal dictatorship that controlled really everything that was said and spoken in the media in Nazi Germany. but they were also very cautious of public opinion within the German community. And for some of these families, the non-Jewish family members might have had connections that went up into the Nazi party. And so it was a very delicate issue for the Nazi government. And they ultimately, yeah, freed the men, and they survived.
It's amazing. One of our docents, Ronnie, is asking about how Irena Sendler smuggled children. She's asking, did she smuggle children out under her dress? Which reminds me of the story that one of our survivor speakers, Bob Jeminder, used to tell about how he and his brother sneaked out of the ghetto under his mother's skirt and her friend's skirt. I know you said that Irena Sendler smuggled young children and babies out in a number of ways, including in bags.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that as you just pointed out with Bob Jeminder's story, I don't think that was a unique method. And she certainly could have smuggled children in that way. She was basically working to smuggle children out in any sort of available method. And so whether it was under her skirt or in a sack of potatoes or in a toolbox, she was organizing for that to happen.
Do we know anything about Irena Sendler that helps us understand her motivation to take such great risk? And I mean, I'm sure there were other women and men in similar positions who could have done the same thing, and maybe there were others who did. I'm just curious, what motivated someone like her to take on that?
Yeah, I mean, of course I can't speak for her, but she was a social worker, nurse, so that it was kind of like the same sort of profession at that time. You could use both words simultaneously. So clearly she was already, we can assume, a person who cared about others. And I know that later in life, she did have a Jewish male companion. And so clearly she didn't see Jewish people as other. She saw them probably equally as human beings. And there are probably very many reasons why she got involved in the underground, but she probably also sensed like the true pure innocence of children. And the ability to smuggle babies, like I said, out of the ghetto also then allowed, the babies didn't know who their real identity was. So it was a little bit easier to find a hiding space for them.
Right. But you said that she kept records of the baby's original identities and names and parents. I'm wondering, do we know how many of them were able ever to reunite with their families after the war?
The majority did not reunite with their families because their families had been murdered. But what's incredible is that the majority were able to reunite with their original identities. And I think that's so significant. It wasn't just about saving their lives, but saving their Jewish identity and giving them an option to know who they truly were. And what their family truly was. And I think that's incredible. I think that shows an extra layer of caring and really complexity in her understanding of what is identity.
Right. And you mentioned that Irena Sendler lived to a very old age. Do you know whether she kept in touch with any of these children?
I don't believe she kept in touch with them right after the war, but later on, some of them did seek her out, and her story was very well known later in life. Not, of course, you have to imagine what happened in Poland after the war, and so there's a whole political situation there, but really after, I think, the 80s, it was well known. She was able to meet some of the children she saved, and she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize within my lifetime. It was the year that Al Gore, I believe, won. So fairly recently.
We have a question from Avia, one of our docents, about the Sommerkommando revolt and how did the prisoners obtain the gunpowder and smuggle it, and what was it that was blown up? Was it a gas chamber or a crematorium?
Yeah, so when I think we think of Auschwitz, we think of like Auschwitz as one camp or two camps, and it was actually a massive complex of dozens of camps. And there were many different sort of factories that were being used for the war effort, whether they were making ammunition or synthetic rubber. And so from the munitions factory, they were able to smuggle tiny amounts of gunpowder because it was accounted for. And so they would even be as simple as something as putting it in a little bit of your fingertip. Like that's how small that they were able to smuggle and take very patiently each day. And so if you've been to Auschwitz-Birkenau, if you've ever seen it, you understand that one building was a crematoria and a gas chamber. So it was part of one structure. And there were several of these structures, and each one was a crematoria and a gas chamber kind of constructed together. And so they blew up one of those. So they blew up one of the crematoria, but it was also connected to a gas chamber.
Okay. Back to the Rosenstrassa protest, someone's asking about the kind of the converse of that situation, where there are Jewish women who married German men, and were they treated in the same way?
I mean, so they were all German, but just some were Jewish and some were not Jewish, Aryan, as the Nazis would have called them. And so, yes, there were German Jewish women who were married to German non-Jewish men, and those did, of course, exist, but in that context, like this was a roundup of men, so they weren't part of this specific roundup. But yes, actually the Nazis had a very, I mean, I could speak on this for a very long time, but they had a very sort of complex understanding of these mixed marriages, and they had them in categories of like privileged mixed marriages or not privileged mixed marriages. And basically, if a man was Jewish and a woman was not Jewish, they were considered worse than if, or not as privileged as if then the woman had been Jewish and the man non-Jewish. Does that make sense? So basically, if the man was Jewish, it was considered less privileged than if the woman partner was Jewish.
Why was that?
I mean, it's based in like sexist notions of like family, and sort of like that when you're a woman, you marry into a man's family, like even if you think about last names. I mean, this is a larger thing, but also if couples had children, if the children were baptized, then they were considered privileged. If the children had been raised Jewish, then they were considered not privileged. If the couple didn't have children, they could be considered privileged. So there were all of these different sort of hierarchical issues that the Nazis devoted a lot of time to. So yes, they did exist.
Okay. Someone has a question about whether there's any evidence of Nazis assisting in any of the movements within the camps.
So, I mean, hearing from survivors, you'll sometimes hear of a survivor who talks about how a Nazi guard treated them nicer than treated the others, or smuggled them a sandwich, or looked the other way when something happened. So yes, those are small acts of resistance, I guess. But so you do have that. And then also, if you are studying what happened in Denmark, it actually was a Nazi who released information to the underground about when the planned deportation was. So you do have moments in which members of the Nazi party would participate in rescue and resistance. And of course, probably the most famous is Oskar Schindler. He was a member of the Nazi party, and he ultimately helped rescue Jews.
Right, thank you. I have a question about Hannah Senis. I'm wondering, I mean, in the United States, we have notions of women not participating fully in combat, and I know that's slightly different in Israel. But at the time, how unusual was it for a woman to have the role of a paratrooper in the British Army?
I mean, it was not the norm, certainly. Notions of women, I think, fighting is a very recent thing that people are accepting. And it was not common, but she was approached in part because of her language, her knowledge of language. She had been born in Hungary, so spoke fluent Hungarian. Also, she was very bright and passionate. And so she initially was trained to decipher codes with like wireless remotes, as I was saying earlier. And then ultimately she probably volunteered and wanted to be a paratrooper who would help smuggle. Also, I should say though, and I'm actually not sure if this played a role in this decision, but in Nazi-occupied Europe, it was much easier for a woman to be undercover than for a man to be undercover. So if they were able to smuggle her into Europe, it would be less likely it would be harder to prove she was Jewish than if it was a man, because Jewish males were circumcised.
Right.
And so I'm not sure if that's a factor, but it could very well have been.
Right. Someone's asking if Hannah Senish's mother was deported, but her family lived in Palestine.
No, they were in Hungary, her parents at the time.
Oh, they were?
Yes. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that her mom, so after she had been arrested in Hungary and tortured, they actually located her mother and arrested her mother to put pressure on Hannah Senis to release the information. And Hannah did not release the information, and ultimately her mother did survive.
Do you see this question about other parachutists? Someone says there were others, Sarah Braverman, Aviva Reif.
I see. So Hannah Senis was not the only paratrooper, as I said. I think there were about 30 of them who were all Jewish, who were all in the Mandate, but were part of the British Army at that time, which also was not uncommon. I mean, there were many people who were in the British Mandate who wanted to join and fight for what was happening in Europe.
We're almost out of time. I have a last question. If you're willing to share, I of course know that your grandparents were survivors. I didn't know the story about the woman you mentioned, Elizabeth, who rescued your grandfather. I'm curious what the circumstances were.
So the circumstances, my grandfather was born in Poland in 1939. The Nazis invaded. He was the oldest of 3 children. My grandfather was born into a fairly upper middle class family. They had cleaning ladies and chefs, and they also had a German nanny, this woman, Elizabeth. And she was Polish born, but was German. Her family was German. And she made the decision to stick with my grandfather's family as they escaped the Nazis, and ultimately took my grandfather's younger siblings and got them fake papers saying that they were her children. She wrote back to her family in Germany that she had been knocked up by some random guy, and it was a lot of shame. And she took my grandfather's younger siblings to church and taught them, the prayers, and really raised them as her own children, and also would help my grandfather, who was a little bit older, so it was more complicated, survive. And they always were staying in contact. And then after the end of the Holocaust, my great-grandfather had also survived and married her. And so they became married, which is why her last name ends up being Gessler, which is the same as my last name. But she basically stayed with them from 1939 till 1945, doing whatever she could, whether it was showing her German ID cards or speaking in German or smuggling food to save the family.
And when was she nominated or awarded Righteous Among the Nations?
I want to say about 15 years ago, but it could be longer ago. Maybe it was around 2003, I think. Time is a bizarre concept right now.
It is.
But she lived the rest of her life married to my great-grandfather. So even like my father knew her. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they lived together until they passed away.
Yeah. So we're about out of time. Is there anything else you want to add before we finish?
I just want to add that I hope one of the main takeaways from this talk is that anyone can do the right thing. And really, if you think about a time in which stereotypically women were considered housewives, that so many of them were able to be so courageous. And whether it was saving one person, like saving Idel, the survivor, or if it's saving 2,500 children, I mean, all of it is really important. And, it's because of these courageous people that people like myself are living today. So I think it's an important lesson in understanding that one small good deed can actually have a very large effect.
You're right. It's a very important lesson for all of us, especially at a time like this one where many of us feel powerless, but really there is so much that anyone can do, even to take small actions that make a big difference in people's lives. So Thank you so much for this presentation. It was so interesting and so informative, and I know that people really enjoyed it. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us again for another program. Coming up this week, tomorrow we have a talk by Holocaust survivor Stephen Covery. That's tomorrow, July 23rd at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And next Wednesday, June 29th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, we invite everyone to join us for a conversation with Ben Fate Valaise, whose grandmother, a Native American who grew up near the Arctic Circle, was forcibly taken by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and sent to an Indian boarding school. Ben's grandfather was one of the few members of his Jewish family to escape Europe during World War II. Ben will discuss the intergenerational impact of cultural genocide and systemic hate through the lens of his grandparents' experiences. You can find more information about these events and all of our virtual events on our website, lamoth.org. The museum provides these programs at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by going to our website and making a donation. I want to thank you again, Jordanna, and thank everyone for joining us and spending time with us today. Everyone take care, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.